Now that we've talked about daily activity, some of the issues when we look at monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, it's important to look at what's global manufacturing PMI doing. And some of the stuff that we get comes from the Daily Shot. It's a great place to sign up. You can see the watermark on the right. And it just aggregates a lot of data, which is it's always something good to see. And here is just one with the global manufacturing PMI. And you can see that a lot of the manufacturing is now back into an expansionary period, which is, again, positive to see. It's good to see it in terms of the drivers. But the issue has always been not so much the manufacturing side at this point, but the service side, especially when we see some of the manufacturing rolling over, which if you look at the EM, the emerging markets, you're starting to see that coming back down, even though some of the others are hanging in anywhere between 48 to about 55, depending on what country you are, which is good to see in terms of getting back to a little bit of normalcy. But the overall weight is not so much coming from the manufacturing side, but the services side, because the services is just not following the manufacturing component. And you're seeing less hiring. Now, some hiring is back into expansionary territory, but it's really just over that 50 number. So it's going to be a matter of, well, when does that actually result in new hires and some of these furloughs going away? So again, this is something as a nice bright data point, but this was also something when we consider coming into September, August, September, we started to see some slowdowns. In October, we'll continue to see some of those headwinds, which will be more prominent, especially when we look at manufacturing, key ones being Germany, which we'll talk about in the last segment. Now, here we're just going to talk about South Korea because it's an interesting view, because exports did surprise to the upside, imports surprised to the downside, and manufacturing PMI. Now, it's rallied. It's still in a contractionary standpoint, but it is nice to see you're starting to see some of that robust nature coming in, and it's really being driven by exports. Now, the one thing that we've talked about in the past is where do we look to get a bellwether of health in the market, especially when we look at the global shipping world. And it's really China, Germany, South Korea, Japan. Those are good bellwethers to see, well, what is happening in the international markets? How many goods are flowing? So to see South Korea have a surprise to the upside is a positive. It means that there is some mobility. We're starting to see some more movement through the system. Now, when we look at manufacturing, it's still slow. It's still not in an expansionary level. But again, getting closer to that 48 to 52, you're not really declining or growing, but you're kind of holding steady. So it's good to see some steadiness back into the market. Again, the local components remain weaker in terms of not only just importing, let's say semi-finished goods, raw materials, but also what is the actual consumer doing, which still remains very slow and light, just given the consumer remains cautious overall. And on an Asian level, when we consider how a lot of these countries spend, they're inherently savers. So that's also going to weigh in terms of how quickly they come back to the market. So again, positive data points overall based on the exports, but again, we have to see some more trajectories. Now, this is one when we look at just the composite of the PMI that has come out recently for Spain, Italy, France, Germany, 4 key countries in Europe. We're starting to get this bifurcation. This is what we keep talking about when we look at France and Spain have really started to fall off. And now when we look at the growth of COVID within these areas, France and Spain have been hit the hardest in terms of, outside of the UK, where we see Italy having a little bit of a comfort level, and then Germany. Again, Germany is same thing, tale of two cities, where we're starting to see a little bit more headwinds into September and into October, which again, we'll talk about because there's some data points that are interesting that are a little bit leading in terms of where is this going to go overall. But again, it's a net positive for Germany, but France and Spain will weigh on the overall issues. And when we look at Spain as a whole, they have the most exposure to Turkey. If you think about the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, Spain has the most exposure to Turkey, which could be a knock-on effect. And Spain is not really in the best footing right now, which is going to be a weight on just the overall European activity. And now when we look at the EUROZONE PMI, again, this comes down to those tale of two cities, because The composite is looking at manufacturing and services. So it averages, it pulls it down a little bit to that 50, but we showed the manufacturing where you had some good data, some not so great data, but again, within this tighter range, it's the services that continues to disappoint to the downside and came in at a small contractionary level. So again, that's what's really weighing on some of this return to normalcy as you start to see some of the manufacturing. But again, they're also linked in different ways where if people aren't consuming services, there's only so much hard goods that people are going to consume after you have the backlog that's been filled. Once you have supply chains that have been rejuvenated with inventories, you will start to see some of the headwinds in manufacturing, which are starting to crop up in smaller segments. Again, there's no real smoking gun to say, nope, it's really, it's a hard stop right here. This is the problem. It's just little cracks, which is why we're not seeing the robust growth that we should, given the amount of stimulus we've seen into the market from a fiscal monetary side. But again, enough to kind of get us back to a certain amount of just stability. Again, that services, I think, is a bigger tell when we look at how is this going to progress going forward. Now, looking at some of the PMI data specifically in the U.S., you kind of get an idea of, well, it's, it was good across the board. We had some growth in terms of services. Now, when we talk about services, it's always important to talk about different countries because each one is going to have their own drivers. And the U.S. actually had a surprise to the upside on the service level, and we actually had the hiring side surprise to the upside on the 50, above 50, showing expansion, where the PMI business activity started to slow down. The composite overall, those two pieces missed expectations where servicers beat. So again, this is when we talk about where we were highlighting that manufacturing was going to slow based on some of the data points we were seeing, but services we thought was going to have a little bit of a headwind. We were right in manufacturing, services surprised to the upside. And it's really just a matter of when are small companies coming back. We're seeing some life in small companies in specific locations, specific industries, which is, again, good to see. But there's the still overarching theme of this just getting back to and breaking through this ceiling that we seem to be sitting underneath of. And just based on these data points, it just looks to be more of the same without a real, anything to really ignite us above. And when you think about the election coming up, what is really going to get us there? We had President Trump saying fiscal talks are off and stimulus talks are off until after the election. Market immediately went down essentially 60 handles from peak to trough. And then it's like, oh no, I'm just kidding. We're still talking. It's like, well, I mean, and that we've seen that respond aggressively in the market. And you can see how much the market overall is saying we need stimulus in order to get any sort of real economic momentum. And the question is it going to be enough to get us over that ceiling? And I'm going to say a hard no, but would love to be proven wrong here. So this is the other thing that was surprise to the downside was the August manufacturing numbers. Again, factory orders, and it leads into, well, what does September look like, and then what does October look like? Again, it was still growth. It was still 0.7. It was still above that 0. But again, the trend is moving in the wrong direction, which again we're starting to see in PMIs. We're starting to see in some other little cracks as not only does the consumer lose out on those additional stimulus measures, but also the uncertainty of new stimulus measures starts to weigh on just how freely will they spend. Again, this is why we think that there's going to be that slowdown, especially as we go into October and into the rest of Q4. Now, it's important to talk about the trade balance because you can see just how bad it's gotten. We're back down to essentially 2006 levels. We're about I think it's about $1 billion off of those lows. And the trajectory just going in the wrong direction. The one benefit for this, if you want to consider it a benefit, imports are starting to slow. So even though exports aren't really accelerating, imports slowing is going to help kind of alleviate some of this pressure. And the reason why I say alleviate is this will be a net negative when we consider the calculation of GDP but at the same time, it was unavoidable. We had to see some of this rejuvenation. We had to see supply chains get refilled, and it really comes from the international market. We've talked many times over the last few months about trade and how trade at the U.S. is going to be problematic, especially on the export levels, and with the U.S. dollar remaining. Right now it's the DXY is at about 93.65, so we're essentially flattish with, I think, is going to be an upward trajectory in terms of just the dollar strength, which will again put more headwinds on exports because it makes our exports more expensive. And just imports, again, is just now that the supply chains are starting to normalize, those are things that are going to roll off, which should help this as less imports come through. Now, when we look at layoffs and just to kind of round out, we're going to go deeper into the jobs market in the next segment. But it's interesting to look at Google and the Google data and looking at what are searches doing, how are people viewing, and this is layoff searches. As people go through September, as the end of September, we started to see an uptick in people searching for jobs. What happens in a layoff? What happens with getting some sort of support? And it's really because we had a ton of, I think it was 15 at last count, large companies announce additional layoffs as we go through the remainder of September, as we went through the remainder of September into October, and they should be carried out through the remainder of October, which again is going to put additional headwinds when we think of new jobs and new unemployment, and which is going to keep those continuing claims elevated and keep new issued unemployment elevated as well. And the other side, when we consider, okay, well, if people are getting furloughed, well, what part of that is being hit? And it's interesting to look at construction, because construction searches have started to fall. And the Midwest was a big driver in terms of where things were. If you look at the Midwest region, Northeast region, the Midwest region has really started to come down. And when we look at where homes are being built, what does new construction look like? What does activity look like? Now that banks are tightening their loan requirements, we've seen loan generation slow down as banks and others are requiring either more collateral or more proof of revenue. That you've started to see not only construction and industrial loans and bonds slow, but we're also seeing that on the consumer level, which again is just kind of pulling us down into a bit more of a normal rate, which, when you're calculating GDP, you have to consider investment, consumer consumption. And this is just showing that we're starting to see some of that slow down, because it's weird when we look at what is driving. Google Trends tend to be a very good indicator. Like, people searching for COVID symptoms tend to lead spikes in COVID cases by a week to 2 weeks. And it's just interesting the power that you can get in terms of understanding what people are searching for information on. And this is another one of those examples. And now, just to kind of put that into context as we look at the labor force participation, and again, we're going to go deeper into the labor side. The labor force participation is the lowest since 1977. And it's because there's just less people looking for work. And because there's less people looking for work, these are people that have left and technically left the workforce and saying, look, I'm going to wait. I'm going to sit on the sidelines, which is going to artificially make the unemployment rate look a little bit better, because those who have left the workforce or who are not recognized as actively participating will not be calculated in that number. And that's why this is important, because we had a big drop off and we've only recovered maybe half, which is why there's, again, coming back to consumer spending, kind of getting some of this normalcy back, which is just going to be a bigger overhang as we look at the, going forward. And, the other thing is when we look at, well, what does personal income really mean? And when we look at personal income, it's really coming from the government. When we look at the huge surge that we had, that percentage increase was really driven just based on not only $1,200, but also just the additional unemployment benefits. And that, as that whittles down, that's when you start to see this aggressive slowdown in just overall spending, which, if you consider where we're in October, people normally start purchasing for the holiday season. And it's going to be hard if you don't have clarity on jobs, whether getting a new job, maintaining your current job, and or having this support from the government, which is why we continue to think of this as of not only this as disposable income, but also as we look into the unemployment rate and just the stickiness there, that's going to just be an overhang, which is, again, not just a U.S. issue. This is a global issue, which is why when we go back to that second segment and we talk about those daily activities, people are just changing habits. And these are some of those key reasons on why it's just comfort in jobs, comfort in spending just isn't there. And I just don't see it getting there, at least by the end of the year and and personally into 2021.